Hello, I'm Dr. Nathan Gellert. In this video about motivational interviewing, I'll be talking about the skill that is the cornerstone of the counseling profession, listening. Listening is one of the primary ways that we promote engagement. The type of listening you'll be spending a lot of time learning and practicing is called reflective listening, which involves simply restating or mirroring back what the client has said. If you're like many people, you might be wondering why you'd want to do this. Well, in the early stages of counseling, the counselor needs to learn about the client's desires and goals and their importance. Reflective listening is the primary clinical skill that you'll use to engage with clients and explore their goals. Listening will also serve as a foundation for the processes of focusing, evoking, and planning. A mistake many counselors in training make is to assume that they're already good enough listeners. The truth is, you probably are a good listener. You perhaps learned this over the years on the many occasions you played armchair counselor with family, friends, and coworkers. But the skills you already possess will not be sufficient for your future work as a counselor. You are now at a place where you will be challenged to become a master at the art of listening. In the field of counseling, when we think of listening, Carl Rogers often first comes to mind. For Rogers, listening was a pathway to achieve accurate empathy with clients. Later, Rogers' student Thomas Gordon would coin the phrase active listening, which has become the cornerstone of client-centered counseling. Listening is a discipline that takes time and practice to master. Once you master it, you will be able to expertly help clients explore their experiences and perceptions. You will be practicing in alignment with the belief that healing, growth, and recovery do not happen primarily through the process of giving knowledge and expertise to our clients. As you begin to learn the skill of reflective listening, it's helpful to first consider what can get in the way of good listening. Thomas Gordon highlights 12 roadblocks to good listening. They are simply behavioral responses that people often make in response to each other. As you look at this list, I would invite you to consider how you have experienced these responses, these roadblocks in your own life. How did you feel? How did you respond? Your clients will respond in many of the same ways to these roadblocks. They get in the way of engagement and self-exploration. Now we will begin to focus on good listening skills. Of course, there's more to listening than using words. In counseling, there are naturally periods when you will be silent as your client is speaking. It's important to show the client that you are listening to what is being said. There are two primary ways to demonstrate listening, interest, understanding, and curiosity without speaking. First, we must give our undivided attention. Even if a counselor is a great multitasker, when listening to a client, that should be their one and only task at that moment. Aside from that, undivided attention is communicated particularly with the eyes. Maintaining eye contact as the client speaks is the best way for a counselor to show they are truly listening. Be aware, though, of cultural differences. Some cultures may not view eye contact in the same way that you do. Second, the counselor mirrors emotions. Another sign of a good listener involves reflecting with our facial expressions what the client is saying or communicating without words. For example, if a client is speaking with heightened animation about something positive that has happened to them, the counselor might smile and nod in response. Of course, the counselor shouldn't mirror all emotions. If a client is angry, instead of mirroring that emotion, the counselor would instead take on a calming demeanor so as not to exacerbate the client's anger. In considering nonverbal listening, it's important to remember that everything that the counselor does with a client is a clinical intervention. Every question, every silence, every reflection, and every facial expression I believe it's important for a counselor to intimately know how our body, and particularly how our face, can be used as a clinical response to our client. I would encourage you to sometimes stand or sit in front of a mirror and examine your own facial responses to different emotions. This may seem silly at first, but it's important to know and to see what your smile looks like. What does concern look like to you? How about excitement? Actors use this technique, and it can be helpful for us to try too. You might be asking yourself about the deeper clinical utility of active listening. The chart on this slide was developed by Miller and Rollnick to illustrate the complexity of a single speaking and listening interaction. It helps differentiate the constituent parts of speaking and listening and illustrates why reflective listening is so important. We start in box 1. Every statement is preceded by a thought, by an idea, by a meaning. This is what the speaker means. The meaning gets encoded into the words the speaker says. Through the process of hearing, the listener experiences the words the listener hears. Those words are decoded by the listener into what the listener thinks the words mean. In counseling, the counselor reflects back to the client what the listener thinks the words mean. Of course, there are 3 places in this process where mistakes can happen: the encoding, hearing, and decoding. In encoding, the speaker might not choose the right words to convey the meaning they intended. In hearing, the listener might not hear the words correctly. And in decoding, the listener might not interpret the words to the meaning the speaker intended. Every reflection the counselor offers is a check on the accuracy of these 3 processes. This also means that we must approach every reflection as a guess about what the client means. Why not just ask a question instead of reflecting? Reflections and questions place the client in different positions. Questions necessarily come from within the counselor's own worldview and inherently are prone to our own biases. Questions also put the client in a defensive position. To understand this, just think about the stereotypical scene of an investigator interrogating a suspect under bright, hot lights. Of course, that doesn't describe your counseling office, but the feeling for clients can be the same. Questions encourage the client to defend their position, and that's not the goal of counseling. Our goal is openness to change through an exploration of change. Reflective listening, on the other hand, invites the client to consider their position, their ideas, their goals more deeply. This is the process of evoking. The counselor works to evoke from within the client's thoughts, feelings, and experiences. A more scientific way to think about reflecting as a guess about meaning is to say that reflections involve hypothesis testing. Remember, the counselor needs to check to see if what we think the client means is really what the client means. As you train yourself to think reflectively, remember that every client statement has many possible meanings. Consider the client statement, "I'm just not feeling it at my job anymore." Does the client mean that she's fed up with how her boss is treating her? Does she mean that she's bored with her job responsibilities? Or that the pay isn't good enough? Often we decode a certain meaning and assume it's accurate, often at a subconscious level. A skilled listener, a skilled counselor, is aware that when we are reflecting, we're only checking a guess, a hypothesis, rather than assuming we understand. When forming a reflection, it's important to pay attention to the tone and pitch of our voice. Consider the following statements. You're feeling sad? You're feeling sad. You'd like to feel closer to your son? You'd like to feel closer to your son. You're excited about getting promoted. You're excited about getting promoted. Notice how the inflection turns up at the end of the question and down at the end of the reflection. It's natural for counselors in training to struggle a bit with this difference. You'll want to begin noticing the difference as you practice these new listening skills. There are two main types of reflections that you'll be learning and practicing during your training. Simple reflections involve repeating back nearly verbatim what the client has said. Simple reflections have their use, but they tend to keep conversation at a surface level, like a rock skipping across a pond. If you start noticing that you're not getting anywhere with a client or struggling with what to say next, then chances are you're relying too heavily on simple reflections. Complex reflections, on the other hand, help deepen the conversation. They add meaning or emphasis to the conversation. They often make a guess at meaning that might not be explicitly stated. Consider this interaction. The client starts off by stating, "I think I'm probably being too careful. My last test results were good. It just scares me when I feel pain like that." And the counselor responds by making a guess, "It reminds you of your last heart attack." The counselor's response, this reflection, this guess, can help move the client to a deeper, more vulnerable place of thinking and feeling. When counselors reflect, we often don't use the exact words the client has used. No client wants to experience talking to a parrot. Of course, there are many words to describe the same emotions. Consider some synonyms to describe anger: rage, vexation, exasperation, displeasure, crossness, irritation, irritability, indignation, annoyance, fury, outrage, ire. When reflecting, it's best to choose words that slightly understate the emotion the client is expressing, because this invites the client to continue exploring and sharing. Overstating, on the other hand, can have the adverse effect of causing a defensive reaction from the client, a reaction where they back off and disagree with what they have just shared. And finally, let's talk about a few helpful hints about reflections. In my experience, the best reflections are often short. Remember, the counselor's goal is to get out of the way of the client as much as possible and keep the focus on the client's thoughts and feelings. Longer reflections tend to shift the focus onto the counselor. It's usual for a client to speak for several minutes at a time without interruption. In reflecting, the counselor is being tasked with choosing which pieces to reflect back to the client. This process is similar to highlighting a book as you're studying. Highlighting every sentence wouldn't be helpful. The counselor needs to pick out the most important pieces to reflect. In this way, reflections also serve as a tool for guiding the client. The client is most likely to continue talking about whichever piece the counselor reflects. Reflections are particularly helpful as a tool for engaging with clients. Counselors in training tend to want to ask their clients question after question. A good way to build new clinical skills is to reflect after the client has responded to your question, and then reflect again after the client's answer. Okay, thanks for joining me for this video. In the next video, I'll talk about the 4 core motivational interviewing skills, which are open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summarizations. And please click the subscribe button to get updates when new videos are posted.